In a small, seemingly idyllic town, Sheriff Samuel Lewis was the face of law and order. He was a man of few words, yet his presence alone commanded respect and a sense of security among the townsfolk. Sheriff Lewis had been a staple in this community for over 2 decades, embodying the quiet strength that everyone depended on. He was a father to 2 young children, both of whom were still struggling to come to terms with the recent loss of their mother. The sheriff's wife had passed away the previous year, leaving him a widower, a role that added a subtle sadness to his otherwise steadfast character. Sheriff Lewis's reputation was built not just on his professional accomplishments, but on the kind of presence he offered to people. He was often seen walking through the town square, greeting shop owners and exchanging a few words with the local pastor or the elderly neighbors sitting on their porches. He had this way of making others feel heard, listening intently to even the smallest concerns. Townspeople trusted him instinctively, not just because he wore the badge, but because of the fairness and integrity with which he carried himself. Despite his approachable nature, there was a certain mystery to Sheriff Lewis. Many residents sensed there were stories he left untold, moments in his life shrouded in the kind of secrecy that only those who'd endured true hardship could carry. He was the type of person who would always lend an ear but rarely shared much about himself. His silence on personal matters added to his enigmatic appeal, and people respected his privacy, never questioning why he kept his emotions so tightly guarded. In the sheriff's modest office, which doubled as the town's police station, he worked diligently. His desk was cluttered with paperwork, evidence bags, and folders that documented years of minor disputes, family altercations, and small-scale thefts that defined the relatively quiet nature of their town. He didn't need much assistance, as crime in their area was minimal. Most days were filled with routine tasks, responding to noise complaints, mediating disputes among neighbors, and helping with lost pets. It was a life of relative simplicity, a life that suited him well. Yet, Sheriff Lewis was more than a quiet figure. He had a complex side, shaped by his own experiences and losses. The previous year had been a particularly hard one for him. His wife's passing left him to manage his responsibilities as both a sheriff and a single father. The weight of his dual roles showed in small ways, the lines under his eyes, the way his gaze sometimes drifted as though he was miles away, and the slight, weary slump in his shoulders as he moved through his daily routine. The townspeople occasionally noticed his absent expression and sympathized with his grief, often offering small gestures of kindness, freshly baked pies, flowers, and words of support. But Lewis rarely accepted the help. He was a man who prided himself on resilience, on pushing through life's hardships without leaning on others. It was both a strength and a weakness, as it left him isolated even as he served the very people he protected. On a particular Friday evening, as the sun began to set, Sheriff Lewis found himself patrolling the outskirts of town. A storm was expected to roll in over the weekend, and he wanted to ensure everything was secure. The fading light cast long shadows over the roads and fields, adding an air of stillness that was both serene and ominous. As he drove, his thoughts drifted back to his family and the life he had before his wife's passing, a life that felt almost like a distant memory. His patrol took him to a familiar road that led out toward the hills, a route he rarely took unless a call came in from the more isolated homes on the town's edge. As he glanced at the darkening sky, a strange sense of unease washed over him, something he couldn't quite place. It was a feeling he dismissed almost as quickly as it had come, attributing it to the stillness of the landscape and the approaching storm. Returning to the main part of town, Sheriff Lewis noticed a few lights still on at the local diner, where some of the town's regulars gathered in the evenings. He pulled up outside, deciding to stop in for a cup of coffee before heading home. Inside, the townspeople greeted him warmly. They respected him, and in their eyes, he was more than just a sheriff. He was a symbol of safety and reliability in their small corner of the world. As he sipped his coffee and exchanged small talk with the townspeople, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It was the kind of intuition he had developed over years on the job, a subtle but nagging sense that all was not as it seemed. For now, however, he put those thoughts aside, choosing instead to finish his coffee and enjoy a few moments of peace. Little did he know, This quiet night would mark the beginning of a change in the peaceful town he had sworn to protect. Sheriff Samuel Lewis's steady life took an unexpected turn when he encountered Zachary "Zach" Owens, a 17-year-old with an intense focus and quiet ambition. Zach wasn't the type of young man who typically attracted attention. He was reserved, with a demeanor that spoke of someone who preferred to blend into the background rather than stand out. But there was something about him that piqued Sheriff Lewis's curiosity, something familiar. The two met in a modest setting, at the town's annual Community Volunteer Day. Zach had signed up to help with the event, spending most of his time stationed at the local shelter. Sheriff Lewis noticed the young man's work ethic as he coordinated supplies and assisted residents. He was meticulous, keeping his focus even as others grew distracted. Lewis saw a seriousness in Zach that reminded him of his younger self. When the day ended and the townsfolk began heading home, Sheriff Lewis stayed back, struck by the young man's perseverance. He watched as Zach organized the last of the boxes and meticulously cleaned up the area, a rare dedication in someone so young. Seizing the moment, Sheriff Lewis approached him, initiating a conversation that quickly turned to Zach's aspirations. Zach revealed that he wanted to go into law enforcement, specifically hoping to become a sheriff like Lewis one day. For Zach, the sheriff represented everything noble and just. He spoke with an intensity that surprised Lewis, describing his desire to serve the community and maintain order. Lewis listened attentively, impressed by Zach's sincerity and sense of purpose. Recognizing a kindred spirit, Lewis made an offer that both excited and surprised Zach. He offered to mentor him, providing the guidance and experience that could give the young man an edge in such a challenging career. This was not something Lewis typically did. His role rarely allowed for personal connections, and he guarded his private life closely. But Zach's determination and quiet intensity struck a chord, stirring a faint memory of the path he'd once taken as a young man. Their mentorship began in small ways. Lewis allowed Zach to shadow him on patrols, where he shared practical advice on how to read people, handle conflicts, and navigate the responsibilities of upholding the law. Sheriff Lewis taught him to notice the small details others might overlook, the suspicious glance, the hurried footsteps, or the subtle shift in a person's tone. He was preparing Zach for more than just a job. He was preparing him for a lifelong commitment to the principles he himself upheld. Over time, however, Lewis began to notice something unsettling about Zach's focus. While Zach displayed remarkable discipline and attentiveness, he occasionally displayed an almost obsessive interest in power dynamics and control. Sheriff Lewis dismissed these moments as the understandable zeal of a young man eager to prove himself. But small, troubling instances began to accumulate. One afternoon, while driving through the outskirts of town, Zach eagerly questioned Lewis about various techniques used in interrogation, wanting to know how to detect lies and extract the truth. His fascination with the subtleties of influence and authority went beyond mere curiosity. Sheriff Lewis felt a slight unease, but reminded himself that it was natural for someone passionate about law enforcement to show such interest. As weeks passed, Lewis kept a close eye on Zach, torn between pride in his young protégé's progress and an instinctive wariness. Zach's intensity seemed to grow with each lesson, almost as if he were studying Lewis himself as much as the work. At times, the sheriff felt as if he were looking at his own reflection, one that both mirrored and distorted his sense of duty. This duality troubled Lewis, but he chose not to address it directly, fearing it would discourage Zach or ruin what had become an unexpected bond. Sheriff Lewis couldn't shake the sense that Zach represented a path he might have taken had circumstances been different. Perhaps Zach's fervor, though at times unsettling, could be refined, honed into something positive. One particular night, however, an incident made the sheriff reconsider his stance. They were out on patrol, responding to a call about a suspected break-in on the outskirts of town. When they arrived, they found the situation under control, with the owner insisting it had been a false alarm. But Zach's demeanor during the encounter was unsettling. He stood tensely, his gaze fixed on the homeowner in a way that seemed almost accusatory. Sheriff Lewis had to signal to him subtly, reminding him to back down, to ease the tension rather than escalate it. That night, as they drove back to the station, Sheriff Lewis decided it was time to speak with Zach. He had seen himself in Zach and wanted to be a positive influence, but he recognized a line was being crossed, one he couldn't ignore. In a calm but firm manner, he reminded Zach that serving the community was about protection and trust, not control or intimidation. Zach nodded, seeming to absorb the sheriff's words. But as they parted ways, Lewis couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that his influence on Zach might not have the intended effect. As he closed up the station and prepared to go home, Sheriff Lewis felt a weight settle on him. The mentorship he'd hoped would shape a young man's future had begun to expose an undercurrent of darkness, hinting that his own shadow might have fallen on Zach in ways he hadn't anticipated. As Zach's mentorship continued, what had started as occasional meetings in Sheriff Lewis's office quickly grew more frequent. Initially, the young man would come by once or twice a week, always eager, hanging on every word the sheriff shared. But over time, these meetings increased, often stretching late into the evening, with Lewis offering more complex insights into law enforcement, tactics, and even some of the town's unspoken undercurrents. The sheriff's office, a modest space decorated with framed certificates, local awards, and a collection of books on criminal justice, became a place of informal yet intensive education. Lewis would close the blinds to block the late afternoon sun and make sure the door was only slightly ajar, creating an atmosphere that felt more private, almost conspiratorial. He wanted to convey to Zach the responsibility that came with authority, something he felt was best taught in private. One afternoon, Zach sat across from the sheriff, taking notes as Lewis shared a story from his early career. He recounted a case that had lingered unsolved for years due to one overlooked detail, a case that had taught him the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. Zach's eyes widened with interest, eager to absorb every detail. Sensing Zach's curiosity, Lewis leaned in, lowering his voice slightly, as if the weight of the story required it. He explained how in real policing, especially in a small town, the law had shades of gray. The badge, he told Zach, isn't just a symbol of power, it's a responsibility to understand people, their motives, and sometimes, to keep the peace in ways that others might not understand. The sheriff's words had a double meaning, but Zach's intense nod suggested he understood, or thought he did. As the mentorship sessions continued, Lewis began introducing Zach to real scenarios, walking him through old case files that had once crossed his desk. Some cases were simple, shoplifting, trespassing, and minor assaults. Others, however, revealed a darker side of their town, touching on matters that rarely made it to the public eye. Lewis used these files as a way to teach Zach about the pressures and choices that often came with law enforcement. He presented the cases in a way that hinted at the limitations of the justice system, sometimes showing that small compromises were necessary to maintain control and stability. Zach listened carefully, but Lewis couldn't ignore the glint in the young man's eyes, an intensity that seemed to exceed mere interest. Zach often asked probing questions, focusing on the decisions that had to be made when justice and practicality clashed. He asked about instances when discretion was used instead of strict adherence to protocol, and Lewis, initially cautious, found himself occasionally blurring the lines between teaching and sharing confidences. On one particular night, Lewis decided to show Zach something he rarely shared, a log of unsolved cases. These weren't just crimes, they were mysteries that had lingered, creating unease within the sheriff himself. He handed Zach the file on a long-forgotten burglary in which valuables had vanished under puzzling circumstances. Lewis spoke of how sometimes, for the sake of the town's image, certain cases were quietly closed without resolution. The sheriff emphasized that he shared these things not to encourage secrecy but to underline the realities of preserving peace in a town like theirs. Zach pored over the cases with quiet fascination. He made notes, sometimes tapping his pen thoughtfully as if working out strategies. His dedication impressed Lewis, but there was an undercurrent of concern as well. Zach's growing desire to be involved in these complexities and his evident thrill over the confidential details went beyond what Lewis had intended. After a few of these meetings, Lewis observed a subtle shift in Zach. He seemed to view the town differently, his gaze sharper, lingering on familiar faces as if analyzing them. In one instance, as they walked the main street, Zach noted certain people with a pointed curiosity, asking Lewis about their backgrounds or past incidents he might have dealt with. Lewis answered sparingly, but he felt a sense of unease. Had he given the young man too much insight? By the end of that week, the sheriff had second thoughts about continuing with such candid conversations. He wondered if his intent to guide Zach might be warping into something else. That night, as he locked up the office, he considered setting boundaries. But the thought faded as he reassured himself of Zach's dedication, hopeful that his mentorship would serve its purpose. Zach began noticing inconsistencies in Sheriff Lewis's behavior. At first, he dismissed them, chalking them up to the stern, by-the-book nature of a man who had seen decades of service. Yet, over time, these oddities became harder to ignore. Lewis, once open in his advice and mentorship, now seemed to guard certain pieces of information, occasionally leaving his thoughts unfinished, allowing only veiled hints to surface. One night, Zach entered the office for their usual meeting, and Lewis was already there, seemingly engrossed in a pile of documents. He barely looked up as Zach walked in, motioning for him to sit. The atmosphere felt tense, and Zach's questions about their latest case files went unanswered. Lewis instead shifted the conversation, asking Zach if he trusted him, a question that caught the young man off guard. "Yes, of course," Zach replied, searching for an explanation in Lewis's expression. But the sheriff's face remained unreadable, his gaze hard. It was as if Lewis was measuring Zach, testing his loyalty, probing for any sign of doubt or hesitation. "Good," Lewis finally said, placing a heavy hand on Zach's shoulder, his tone firm. "Because in this line of work, trust is everything. You keep what we discussed between us. No need to involve others in matters they wouldn't understand." From then on, Zach became increasingly wary, yet he felt bound by loyalty to his mentor. Still, there were details that didn't sit well with him. During another session, Lewis outlined a past case, leaving out certain facts and creating a narrative that seemed incomplete. When Zach asked about specific actions taken to resolve the case, Lewis gave only vague answers, sidestepping any mention of what happened after. It was as though Lewis was intentionally leaving gaps in the story. A subtle tension began to develop between them. Zach found himself second-guessing everything Lewis said, questioning motives he had once trusted. But every time Zach tried to get a straight answer, the sheriff would dismiss his questions, either by telling him it wasn't relevant or suggesting he wasn't ready to understand just yet. This secrecy began to wear on Zach, but Lewis always found ways to reel him back in, balancing encouragement with hints of disappointment if he sensed Zach's doubts. One evening, as they were reviewing an unsolved case that had left the town on edge, Zach pressed Lewis on details that had been left out of public reports. Lewis, clearly irritated by the probing questions, leaned back inside, choosing his words carefully. He reminded Zach that as an officer, he would need to learn discretion to protect certain information for the greater good of the town's stability. This, he claimed, was part of maintaining order. He looked directly at Zach and added, "Some things you don't tell anyone, not even your closest friends." Zach felt a chill at the sheriff's words, sensing an underlying threat disguised as advice. Lewis began to test Zach's willingness to stay quiet by asking him to sign confidentiality forms for their training. He emphasized that they were simply for procedural reasons, ensuring Zach wouldn't share sensitive details with others. Though Zach felt uneasy, he didn't want to disappoint his mentor and reluctantly agreed. Over the following weeks, Lewis subtly reinforced this trust, praising Zach's dedication while reminding him of the importance of keeping quiet about their sessions. But as the secrecy deepened, Zach began to feel trapped. In one instance, Lewis shared a case detail that seemed off, a discrepancy that made Zach question the official story. When he asked Lewis about it, the sheriff's expression darkened. "You're asking too many questions," he warned. Then, his tone softened, and he smiled, saying, "Trust me, Zach. There are things you'll understand when you've spent more time on the job." Lewis's manipulation was both subtle and insidious. He kept Zach on edge, alternating between praise and veiled threats. Over time, Zach found it harder to separate loyalty from fear. He felt tangled in a web of secrets, unsure of which parts of Lewis's teachings were genuinely valuable and which served a hidden purpose. The relationship between Sheriff Lewis and Zack grew closer, reaching a point where Zack found himself bound to the sheriff by loyalty and dependence. The sheriff skillfully used his authority and influence, shaping Zack's perceptions, until Zack's loyalty verged on unquestioning trust. In many ways, Zack had come to see Lewis as not just a mentor, but as a surrogate father figure, filling the void left by his own absent father. This dependency only strengthened as Lewis continued to reward Zack's loyalty with praise and trust. Every small achievement Zack made was met with encouragement from Lewis, who would lean in and say, "See, you're learning what it takes. Not everyone gets this far." These words fed Zack's sense of purpose and worth, making him feel like he belonged to a unique inner circle, one that Lewis alone controlled. On a cold winter evening, Lewis called Zack to his office for what he described as a special assignment. Zack arrived to find the sheriff waiting with a solemn expression, holding a sealed envelope. He explained that the information within was highly confidential and needed to be handled with extreme care. "I'm trusting you, Zack." "Not everyone could handle this," Lewis said, tapping the envelope thoughtfully before handing it over. Zack, eager to prove himself, took the assignment without question, feeling a surge of pride. The tasks Lewis assigned became more secretive, drawing Zack deeper into operations he barely understood but trusted as essential to the town's stability. Each task, each assignment, served to isolate Zack further from his peers, who couldn't understand the gravity of his new responsibilities. Whenever Zack expressed doubt, Lewis would assure him, "You're doing the right thing." Sometimes that's a lonely road. One evening, as Zack was reviewing case files, Lewis entered the room, closed the door, and sat across from him. In a serious tone, he began sharing details about certain individuals he considered threats to the town's peace, painting a picture of hidden dangers only they, as protectors of order, could see. Zack listened intently, hanging on every word, feeling the weight of his responsibility. Lewis spoke about the importance of loyalty and dedication, hinting that these threats required a proactive approach to ensure the town remained safe. Zack soon found himself making morally ambiguous decisions, justified by the sense of duty and loyalty that Lewis had ingrained in him. At times, his instincts told him something was wrong, but his respect for the sheriff silenced those thoughts. He began to believe that the ends justified the means, especially when those means served the greater good, or so he was led to believe. The turning point came when Lewis gave Zack an order that felt distinctly different. He instructed Zack to keep an eye on a particular townsperson, hinting that this individual might have ties to local disturbances. "You'll only be watching," Lewis assured him. "Nothing more, unless I say so." Zack nodded, though he felt a twinge of doubt. However, his loyalty kept him from questioning the sheriff's motives. As weeks passed, Zack's life became a blur of hidden tasks and loyalty tests. The sheriff's influence shaped every decision he made, pushing him to operate in shadows and silence. The boundaries of his own morality grew faint, replaced by an unwavering allegiance to the sheriff's guidance. With each passing day, Sheriff Lewis tightened his hold on Zack's life, embedding himself deeper into every facet of the young man's world. What had started as a mentorship gradually shifted into an all-encompassing dependence. Zack found himself increasingly distant from his family and friends, those he once trusted and confided in. His once vibrant social life dwindled until Lewis was his main, almost exclusive, source of guidance and companionship. It began with subtle suggestions. Lewis would occasionally remark on how Zack's friends didn't understand the weight of his new responsibilities. He pointed out that his family, although well-meaning, couldn't grasp the demands of a law enforcement career. "They'll never fully get it, Zack," Lewis would say with a hint of pity in his voice. "They're not cut out for this line of work. It takes someone special, someone strong." This refrain became a common theme in their conversations, steadily reinforcing the notion that only Lewis understood him. Slowly, Zack began to withdraw from those closest to him. His mother, once his confidant, grew worried as she noticed her son's increasing isolation. When she asked about his late nights and limited availability, Zach brushed her off, using phrases he'd heard from the sheriff. "Mom, you wouldn't understand. It's just part of the job," he would say, echoing Lewis's voice. Lewis, noticing this drift, seized the opportunity to deepen Zach's reliance. One evening, he invited Zach to join him on a surveillance mission, a routine drive through town under the guise of keeping an eye on potential disturbances. The sheriff made the night seem special, framing it as a privilege and a test of Zach's loyalty. The drive was quiet and tense, with the sheriff occasionally pointing out people they passed and noting their habits. "You see, Zach, everyone has secrets," Lewis murmured. "The trick is to know which secrets are dangerous." The sheriff's constant presence in Zach's life started to feel more essential, filling spaces that his friends and family once occupied. He rarely reached out to anyone outside of his mentor, feeling an increasing sense of duty to protect the sheriff's trust. Every decision Zach made, every goal he set, subtly molded to fit Lewis's ideals. Soon, even when he was alone, Zach found himself adopting Lewis's mannerisms and perspective. He began to see people through a lens of suspicion, mirroring the sheriff's belief that anyone could be a threat. His loyalty to Lewis had grown so strong that he no longer questioned the sheriff's intentions. Instead, he trusted implicitly, convinced that the sheriff's guidance was the only path to achieving his own goals. The sheriff's influence continued to expand, taking control of more than just Zach's time. It started to affect his thoughts, beliefs, and values. Zach felt as though he owed everything to Lewis, and this belief only solidified as the sheriff reiterated their special bond during their late-night discussions. The sheriff would often close their talks with a solemn reminder, "Remember, Zach, you're not like them. You're meant for something greater." With each affirmation from Lewis, Zach drifted further from the life he once knew, tethered now only to the sheriff's mentorship and approval. The bonds between them had become unbreakable, and Zach couldn't see a way out, even if he'd wanted to. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the secluded area by the lake, Sheriff Samuel Lewis took Zach to a place that had always brought him peace. It was a hidden spot, surrounded by towering trees, where the tranquil sounds of nature blended harmoniously with the soft lapping of the water against the shore. This night felt different, charged with an energy that neither of them could ignore. Zach had always admired Sheriff Lewis, not just for his authority but for his wisdom and the sense of safety he provided. As they settled onto a weathered bench overlooking the lake, Zach felt a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. "You've grown so much since we first met," Sheriff Lewis began, his voice steady and sincere. "You're not just a mentor to me, you're like a son. I want to help you succeed in every way I can." Zach felt warmth from those words, a sense of belonging that had been absent from his life for too long. He looked into the sheriff's eyes, searching for reassurance. Their conversation flowed effortlessly as they discussed aspirations, the challenges of law enforcement, and their shared commitment to serving the community. As the evening progressed, the sheriff's demeanor subtly shifted. He leaned closer, and the scent of his cologne mingled with the crisp night air, creating an atmosphere that felt intimate yet comfortable. "Trust is vital in our line of work," he said, resting a hand on Zach's shoulder. The gesture felt reassuring, a sign of their deepening bond. In a moment that lingered, Sheriff Lewis leaned in, their faces just inches apart. Zach's heart raced, caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Then, with a gentle touch, Sheriff Lewis brushed his lips against Zach's cheek, a fleeting gesture filled with warmth and camaraderie. It was a friendly kiss, one that spoke volumes about their evolving relationship, leaving Zach both surprised and exhilarated. The sheriff quickly pulled back, a slight flush on his cheeks. "We're in this together, Zach. I believe in you and what you can achieve." As they sat together, the weight of the moment hung in the air, leaving Zach to reflect on the complexities of their connection. It was a night that marked a turning point, where the line between mentorship and something deeper blurred. Little did they know, this shared moment would lead Zach down a path of self-discovery and challenges that would shape his future. As days turned into weeks, Zach found himself increasingly entangled in a web of confusion and emotional turmoil. The initial thrill of his bond with Sheriff Samuel Lewis had begun to give way to a nagging sense of doubt. Despite the sheriff's charisma and mentorship, Zach couldn't shake the feeling that their relationship had crossed an unspoken line. One evening, as he sat alone in his room, Zach replayed the moments they had shared in his mind. The warmth of the sheriff's touch, the way he had leaned in closer during their conversations, these were all things Zach had once cherished. But now, they felt like shadows looming over him, reminders of something he had not fully grasped. He began to question the nature of their interactions and whether they were truly appropriate. He recalled the sheriff's comforting words, "Trust is essential," and the tender gesture of the kiss on his cheek. Each memory clashed violently with his understanding of what a healthy relationship should be. Zach had grown up with clear boundaries set by his family, and now those boundaries seemed to blur, leaving him feeling isolated and conflicted. The more Zach thought about it, the more intense his feelings of shame and fear became. He had been taught to respect authority and to look up to figures like Sheriff Lewis. However, he couldn't ignore the truth that was beginning to surface. He was becoming increasingly dependent on a man whose intentions felt muddied by a mix of mentorship and something darker. The sheriff, sensing Zach's internal struggle, continued to press him about keeping their moments a secret. "You know how people can talk," he said one day, a hint of urgency in his voice. "They wouldn't understand the bond we have. You're special to me, and I want to protect that." Zach felt a chill run down his spine at the sheriff's words. While he wanted to believe in the sincerity of their relationship, he couldn't help but feel trapped by the weight of the sheriff's expectations. The trust he had once felt began to erode, replaced by a fear of what could happen if he spoke out. What if no one believed him? What if he lost the only support he had? In the quiet moments between them, Zach noticed how the sheriff's demeanor would shift. One minute, he was encouraging, almost paternal, but the next, there was an intensity in his gaze that felt almost predatory. Zach's internal conflict grew, torn between the admiration he felt for the sheriff and the growing fear that he was being manipulated. His friends had started to notice his absences and the way he seemed distracted. One evening, his closest friend, Jamie, confronted him. "You've been different lately, Zach. Is everything okay with you and the sheriff?" The concern in Jamie's voice was palpable, but Zach brushed it off, not wanting to admit his turmoil. As the weeks passed, Zach found himself at a crossroads. He longed to confide in someone, to share the burden of his secret, but the shame was suffocating. The fear of judgment and the repercussions of revealing the truth kept him silent. He felt as though he was living a double life, one in which he admired a man he respected, and another where he felt trapped in a relationship that was becoming increasingly complicated. Ultimately, the internal conflict was tearing him apart. He understood that he had to make a choice, continue down this path, risking his own mental well-being, or confront the reality of his situation. But as he pondered this dilemma, the thought of losing Sheriff Lewis loomed large, making it all the more difficult to take that first step towards liberation. Little did Zach know, the choices he faced would have lasting consequences, shaping the trajectory of his life and forcing him to confront not only his feelings for the sheriff, but also his own identity and autonomy. The struggle for clarity in a murky relationship had only just begun. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere between Zach and Sheriff Samuel Lewis became increasingly charged with tension. Zach's internal conflict was compounded by the sheriff's growing need to exert control over him. What had begun as a mentor-mentee relationship was now morphing into something darker, shrouded in fear and manipulation. One afternoon, while sitting in the sheriff's office, Zach noticed a change in Samuel's demeanor. The sheriff's smile, once warm and inviting, now carried an edge of something menacing. "You know, Zach," he said casually, leaning back in his chair with a confidence that seemed to dominate the room, "people don't always understand the complexity of our work. They can be quick to judge without knowing the whole story." Zach felt a chill creep down his spine. The implication was clear: if he were to speak out about their relationship, the consequences could be dire. The sheriff's casual tone masked a veiled threat, and Zach was left wondering just how far Samuel would go to protect his secrets. A few days later, while driving home, Zach's mind was a whirlwind of anxiety. He recalled a recent conversation he'd had with Jamie, his best friend. Jamie had expressed concern over Zach's well-being, noticing how withdrawn he had become. "You need to be careful, Zach," Jamie had warned. "This doesn't feel right. If something's off, you should talk to someone." Zach felt the weight of Jamie's words, but he was trapped in a web spun by the sheriff, a web that made it nearly impossible to see a way out. Later that week, during another late-night meeting at the secluded spot by the lake, the tension reached a breaking point. The moon cast a silver glow over the water, and the sounds of nature felt eerily amplified in the stillness. Samuel had driven Zach there under the pretense of needing to discuss his future in law enforcement, but the conversation quickly took a turn. "Zach, I trust you," the sheriff began, his voice low and intense. "But trust goes both ways. I wouldn't want you to jeopardize everything we've built together." He leaned closer, his expression serious. "You understand what's at stake, don't you? The community, they can be unforgiving. You wouldn't want to be the topic of gossip, or worse." Zach swallowed hard, his heart racing. The sheriff's words felt like a noose tightening around his neck. It was clear that Samuel was using intimidation to keep him in line, and the realization made Zach feel trapped. The sheriff's threats were not overt, they were subtle, wrapped in a facade of concern. But they cut deeper than any direct accusation ever could. Over the next few days, Zach's paranoia intensified. Every time he heard the siren of a police car in the distance, his heart raced with fear. He began to notice the sheriff's patrol car parked outside his house more often, a silent reminder that Samuel was always watching. Friends and family began to notice his anxiety, but Zach brushed off their concerns, afraid to reveal the truth about his situation. As the sheriff's hold on him tightened, Zach's sense of isolation grew. He felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage, suffocating under the weight of secrecy. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched, not just by Samuel but by the entire town. The sheriff's warnings loomed large in his mind, creating a perpetual state of fear. One evening, while scrolling through his phone, Zach stumbled upon an article about victims of abuse who had finally found the courage to speak out. The stories resonated with him, igniting a flicker of hope deep within. But that hope was quickly extinguished by the overwhelming fear of retaliation. What if he spoke out? Would anyone believe him? Would he become another statistic? The sheriff's manipulation had taken root, and as Zach lay awake that night, he realized he was at a crossroads. The threat of exposure hung over him like a dark cloud, while the desire for freedom flickered just out of reach. Little did he know that the stakes were about to rise even higher, leading to an inevitable confrontation that would change everything. As weeks passed, Zach's internal turmoil began to manifest physically. The anxiety that had taken root in his mind seeped into every aspect of his life, leaving him feeling constantly on edge. Sleepless nights turned into weary mornings, and the bright optimism he once had began to fade like the morning mist. It started subtly. Zach would catch himself lost in thought during classes, his mind drifting to the conversations with Sheriff Samuel Lewis. The sheriff's words echoed in his head, and every time he glanced at the clock, he felt a jolt of panic, convinced that time was running out on him. Friends noticed his distracted demeanor, often asking if he was okay. Zach would force a smile and brush off their concerns, masking the storm brewing within him. At home, the environment became increasingly tense. His mother, a strong-willed woman who had always been attuned to her son's moods, began to notice the changes. "Zach, you seem different lately," she remarked one evening, her brow furrowed with worry. "Is there something going on at school? You can talk to me." Zach felt a pang of guilt. He wanted to confide in her, to share the weight of his fears and the complicated dynamics with the sheriff, but the thought of dragging her into his turmoil paralyzed him. He remembered Samuel's warning about the consequences of revealing their secret. The fear of retaliation was a powerful silencer. "I'm fine, Mom. Just a lot on my mind," he replied, his voice lacking the usual conviction. As days turned into sleepless nights, Zach's health began to deteriorate. He found himself battling headaches and stomachaches that seemed to have no clear cause. The stress gnawed at him relentlessly, making it difficult to concentrate on anything outside his growing fears. One night, as he sat on the edge of his bed, he could feel the anxiety coursing through his veins like a tidal wave, overwhelming and relentless. His mother, increasingly concerned, decided to take matters into her own hands. She began to observe Zach more closely, noting how he flinched at sudden noises and how his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. The weight of her worry pressed heavily on her heart as she recalled how her son had always been so vibrant and full of life. One afternoon, while Zach was supposed to be studying, his mother knocked on his bedroom door. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Zach hesitated, feeling trapped between his desire to protect her and the urge to spill everything. "Sure," he finally replied, forcing a smile as he opened the door. "What's going on with you? You've been so distant," she pressed, her eyes searching his for any hint of the truth. Zach looked down, avoiding her gaze. I'm stressed with school," he said, hoping the vague answer would suffice. His mother wasn't convinced. "Zach, you know you can tell me anything." "I'm here for you," she urged, stepping closer. Zach felt a wave of guilt wash over him. How could he explain the twisted reality of his situation? How could he expose the man who had been a mentor to him, yet instilled so much fear? "I appreciate it, Mom. I just need some time to sort things out," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He could see the concern etched on her face, but he was too frightened to share the truth. The fear of what could happen if the sheriff found out was suffocating. As the conversation drifted to safer topics, Zach's mind remained elsewhere. The pressure of keeping the sheriff's influence a secret was becoming unbearable. He felt like he was trapped in a game where the rules were rigged against him, and the stakes were his very life. In the following days, Zach's symptoms worsened. He found himself withdrawing from friends, avoiding social situations, and spending more time alone. The familiar weight of isolation wrapped around him, making him feel as if he were living in a shadow. His mother continued to worry, but Zach was determined to protect her from the darkness that had seeped into his life. The days turned into a blur of anxiety and dread, and little did Zach know that the culmination of his fears was approaching. The tension in his life was poised to erupt, leading to a confrontation that would change everything. As he navigated the storm within, he remained unaware of the true nature of the threat that loomed just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the days passed, Zach's mood continued to darken, and his mother, Emily, could no longer ignore the signs. She had watched her son transform from a bright, ambitious young man into a shadow of his former self, consumed by anxiety and fear. The once vibrant spark in Zach's eyes had been replaced by a look of constant worry, a fact that gnawed at Emily's heart. One evening, while preparing dinner, she noticed Zach staring blankly out of the window, lost in thought. The fading light illuminated his face, revealing the worry lines that had begun to etch themselves into his youthful skin. Concerned, Emily approached him and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Zach, is everything okay? You've been so quiet lately," she said, her voice filled with genuine concern. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Mom. Just school stuff," he replied, his tone lacking conviction. Emily could tell that something deeper was troubling him, but she didn't press further. Instead, she decided to seek help. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, Emily reached out to Sheriff Samuel Lewis, whom she trusted implicitly. He had always been a pillar of the community, a figure of authority that people looked up to. She believed he could offer guidance and support to her son, unaware that he was, in fact, the very source of Zach's distress. They met in the sheriff's office, a space filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the murmur of distant conversations. Emily sat across from Sheriff Lewis, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. "Sheriff, I'm really worried about Zach," she began, her voice shaky. "He hasn't been himself lately, and I don't know what to do." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression calm and reassuring. "I understand, Emily. Sometimes these young men go through phases. I can keep an eye on him for you," he offered, his tone soothing. He's a good kid, and I know he looks up to me. I'll make sure he's doing okay. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. She trusted Samuel and believed that he could help her son find his way back to happiness. Thank you, Sheriff. I just want what's best for him. He's been through so much, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As they spoke, Samuel felt a sense of satisfaction wash over him. He was adept at manipulating the narrative around him, using his position to maintain control. While Emily viewed him as a protector, he knew that his influence over Zach was growing stronger. The sheriff had successfully positioned himself as both mentor and authority figure, deepening his hold on the young man's life. After the meeting, Emily returned home with a renewed sense of hope. However, her conversation with the sheriff had unwittingly placed Zach deeper into a web of manipulation. Samuel, under the guise of concern, had plans that extended far beyond mere mentorship. Days turned into weeks, and while Emily believed that the sheriff was helping her son, Zach felt increasingly trapped. The weight of his secret grew heavier, and the sheriff's watchful eye felt more like a looming threat than a safeguard. Each encounter with Samuel became a painful reminder of the precarious position he found himself in. One evening, as Emily prepared dinner, she noticed Zach's eyes darting nervously toward the door whenever a car passed by. "You seem anxious, Zach. Is everything really okay?" she asked, her maternal instincts kicking in. "Just a lot on my mind, Mom," he replied, trying to sound casual. But the truth was that Zach was suffocating under the pressure of maintaining the facade. The promise he made to himself, to keep his mother safe and to never reveal the truth about the sheriff, was becoming increasingly burdensome. Meanwhile, Samuel Lewis continued his manipulation, skillfully fostering a deeper bond with Zach while maintaining the pretense of being a supportive figure in his life. He made it a point to show up at the community events, always praising Zach in front of others, solidifying his image as a caring mentor. As the months progressed, the tension within Zach grew. He was caught in a web spun by the very man who was supposed to be a protector. With each passing day, he became more aware of the underlying threats hidden in the sheriff's reassurances, struggling to navigate the treacherous waters of their relationship while fearing for his family's safety. Unbeknownst to Emily, her decision to seek help had inadvertently trapped her son in a dangerous situation, one that would soon spiral out of control, forcing Zach to confront the true nature of their relationship and the implications it held for both his future and his safety. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the small town as Zach sat on the edge of his bed, contemplating a decision that weighed heavily on his heart. For weeks, he had been grappling with the turmoil of his relationship with Sheriff Samuel Lewis, the man he had once admired but who had now become a source of fear and manipulation. The thought of revealing the truth to his mother, Emily, gnawed at him. He had to tell her what was happening, but he was terrified of the repercussions. That evening, as the clock ticked toward dinner time, Zach finally resolved to come clean. He could no longer bear the weight of the secret he had been carrying. He imagined the relief he would feel once the truth was out in the open, and how Emily would finally understand why he had been acting so distant. He hoped that by confiding in her, they could confront the sheriff together and reclaim their lives. Zach walked down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. The closer he got to the living room, the more anxiety bubbled within him. As he approached, he heard Emily on the phone, her voice a comforting sound amidst the chaos of his thoughts. He stood just outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady himself before entering. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, his voice slightly trembling. Emily looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Of course, honey. Is everything okay?" she replied, sensing the seriousness in his tone. Zach nodded, his mind racing with how to start. Before he could gather his thoughts, the door swung open abruptly, revealing Sheriff Lewis standing there, a casual smile on his face that masked the tension in the room. "Evening, Emily. I just came to check on my favorite mentee," he said, his charm disarming. Zach's stomach dropped. The sheriff's presence was a sharp reminder of the power he held over Zach and the growing danger of his secrets being exposed. He felt a wave of panic wash over him, and the words he had planned to say melted away. Sheriff, I was just about to tell Mom something important, Zach managed, his voice firm but wavering under pressure. Samuel's demeanor shifted subtly, his smile fading into a more serious expression. Oh? I think it's best if you keep certain things to yourself, don't you, Zach? The undertone of threat in his voice was unmistakable. He stepped further into the room, positioning himself as a barrier between Zach and his mother. Emily, sensing the tension, looked back and forth between the two men. "What's going on?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "I think Zach might be confused about what it means to be a part of this community," Samuel interjected smoothly, glancing at Zach with a predatory gaze. "Sometimes, the truth isn't as clear-cut as it seems." Zach's heart raced as he realized the sheriff was intent on keeping him quiet. "I'm not confused," he said, his voice growing steadier. "I know what's been happening." Samuel took a step closer, his presence imposing. "And I think you should consider the consequences of speaking out," he warned, his tone lowering to a menacing whisper. "You wouldn't want your mother to get hurt, would you? Or maybe even someone else you care about." Zach froze, the threat hanging heavy in the air. The sheriff's words echoed ominously in his mind, and he felt the walls closing in. He had seen the sheriff's darker side emerge before, and the thought of his family being harmed was unbearable. "Samuel, you need to leave," Emily said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. She sensed that something was deeply wrong and that her son was in distress. Samuel turned his attention to Emily, flashing her a disarming smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just looking out for Zach's best interests, Emily. You know how I feel about keeping our community safe." With a final glance at Zach, who was struggling to keep his composure, Samuel added, "Remember what I said, Zach. This conversation doesn't need to happen. It's better for everyone." He stepped back, leaving the doorway clear but casting a long shadow over the room. Once the sheriff left, silence enveloped the space, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved fears. Zach felt a deep sense of loss as the moment to share his truth slipped through his fingers once again. His heart raced as he realized the power that Samuel still held over him, making it clear that speaking out was no longer an option. Emily turned to Zach, her expression shifting from concern to determination. "What's going on, Zach? You can trust me," she urged, stepping closer to him. But the words caught in his throat. The truth he had wanted to share had become tangled in the sheriff's threats, and he was left feeling more isolated than ever. He wanted to scream, to confess everything, but fear and doubt held him back. As he looked into his mother's worried eyes, he realized that he had become a prisoner of his own silence. The night stretched on, filled with a heavy tension that would not easily dissipate. Zach knew that he needed to find a way out from under Samuel's shadow, but he felt trapped, unsure of where to turn or whom to trust. The realization settled in that this battle was only just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. In the small town of Millfield, the atmosphere had shifted. As whispers began to circulate regarding Sheriff Samuel Lewis's increasingly questionable behavior, the local police department started to take notice. Officers who once viewed the sheriff as a reliable figure of authority began to observe inconsistencies in his actions. Detective Rachel Martinez, known for her keen instincts and unwavering dedication to justice, was particularly troubled by the way Lewis interacted with Zach. She had seen the signs of an unhealthy dynamic and felt compelled to investigate further. During a routine briefing, she voiced her concerns to her colleagues, pointing out the signs of potential manipulation and coercion. "Have you noticed how Zach has been acting lately?" Rachel asked, her tone serious. "There's something off about his relationship with the sheriff. We need to keep an eye on it." Her fellow officers nodded, intrigued by her observations. Over the next few weeks, Rachel took it upon herself to discreetly monitor interactions between Zach and the sheriff. She noted the sheriff's protective demeanor, which, while initially reassuring, now felt suffocating and controlling. Each time Lewis was in the vicinity, she observed Zach's body language, a mix of tension and unease, as if he was under constant scrutiny. One afternoon, Rachel decided to approach Zach directly. She found him at a local cafe, staring out the window, lost in thought. She took a seat across from him, her expression friendly yet firm. "Hey, Zach. Can we talk for a minute?" she asked gently. Startled, Zach turned to her, his eyes widening slightly. Sure. What's up?" "I just wanted to check in with you. I've noticed some changes lately. Are you okay?" Rachel's concern was genuine, and she hoped to encourage him to open up. Zach hesitated, weighing his words carefully. He had grown accustomed to keeping his feelings hidden, but Rachel's sincerity was disarming. "I'm fine, just busy with everything," he replied, forcing a smile. Rachel studied him for a moment, sensing the facade. "You know, it's important to talk about things, especially if you're feeling overwhelmed. I'm here if you need someone to listen," she offered. His resolve faltered, and he looked down at his coffee cup, stirring the remnants absent-mindedly. "It's complicated," he admitted softly. Rachel leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "If there's anything going on with the sheriff, you can trust me. I won't let anything happen to you." The mention of the sheriff sent a shiver down Zach's spine. He thought about the threats and the way Samuel had manipulated him. It was a dangerous game, and he felt trapped. I don't know if I can talk about it," he finally said, the weight of his secret pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Just know that you're not alone in this. If there's something you need to share, I'm here to help," Rachel reassured him, her eyes earnest. As their conversation came to an end, Zach felt a flicker of hope mixed with the familiar anxiety that plagued him. He was torn between the urge to confide in Rachel and the fear of the sheriff's wrath. Meanwhile, as Rachel continued her observations, she began to gather evidence of Lewis's questionable actions. She noted inconsistencies in his reports and interactions with the community. Her determination grew as she pieced together a timeline of events that painted a troubling picture. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in Millfield escalated. Residents began to question the integrity of their sheriff, and whispers of his potential misconduct circulated throughout the town. Rachel's quiet investigation became a beacon of hope for those who felt trapped under the sheriff's oppressive authority. In the shadows, Zach grappled with his fears and the weight of his secret. He wanted to be brave, to speak out against the manipulation he had endured. But with each passing day, the stakes grew higher, and the consequences of his silence became more pronounced. The town stood at a crossroads, unaware of the impending confrontation between truth and deception. In a place where heroes and victims were often defined by perception, the line between them had begun to blur. Zach realized that the time for action was drawing near, and he would need to choose his path carefully. As the days turned into an unbearable weight on Zach's shoulders, he felt the pressure mounting. The lingering fear instilled by Sheriff Samuel Lewis had seeped into every corner of his life, tainting his thoughts and suffocating his spirit. He could no longer ignore the gnawing truth that was eating away at him. The realization struck him one evening while sitting alone in his dimly lit room, surrounded by shadows that felt more oppressive than ever. The only way to escape the nightmare was to confront it head-on. Determined to break free from the chains of silence, Zach recalled the conversation he had with Detective Rachel Martinez. Her sincere concern had planted a seed of courage within him. He realized that sharing the truth, no matter how painful, was the only path to liberation. The sheriff's influence had created a facade of safety, but beneath it lay a quagmire of manipulation and fear. Zach had to speak out. That night, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, Zach found himself pacing back and forth in his room. The weight of his decision pressed heavily upon him, and each step felt like a mile. Finally, he took a deep breath and dialed Rachel's number, his heart racing as he heard the phone ring. "Hello?" Rachel's voice came through, calm and steady. "It's Zach." "I need to talk," he replied, his voice trembling. "Where are you?" "I can come to you," she offered, sensing the urgency in his tone. "Can you meet me at the park?" "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Zach said, feeling a rush of resolve. He quickly dressed and left the house, the cool night air biting at his skin as he made his way to the secluded park where they could speak freely. Upon arriving, he spotted Rachel sitting on a bench, her expression serious yet inviting. He approached her, and she immediately sensed the turmoil within him. "Zach, what's going on?" Rachel asked, her eyes scanning his face for any hint of what he was about to reveal. "I can't keep this to myself anymore. I need you to know everything that's been happening," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As he recounted the events of the past months, the sheriff's manipulative behavior, the weight of his secrets, and the threats that had kept him silent, Rachel listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief. Zach's words poured out like a dam breaking, unleashing the pent-up emotions he had carried for far too long. "He's been controlling me, and I'm scared." "I thought he cared, but it was all a lie," Zach confessed, his eyes welling with tears. "I thought I could trust him, but now I realize he's just been using me." Rachel's face hardened as the implications of Zach's story settled in. "This is serious, Zach. You're not alone in this. We can take this to the department, but we need evidence." Zach nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know I need to. But he'll do anything to keep this quiet. I don't know how he'll react if he finds out I've spoken to you." "Your safety is the priority," Rachel assured him. "We'll take precautions. But we need to act fast. The sooner we can gather evidence and confront him, the better." As the two strategized under the starry sky, the tension of impending confrontation loomed. Zach's heart raced at the thought of exposing the sheriff, a man who had wielded power over him and manipulated his life. Yet, the realization that he was taking a stand against his abuser filled him with a sense of empowerment he had never known before. Over the next few days, Zach and Rachel worked together, gathering information and compiling evidence against Sheriff Lewis. They met in secret, often in the dead of night, poring over records and witness accounts that would ultimately bring the sheriff's actions to light. With each piece of evidence they uncovered, Zach felt a mix of fear and hope. He was no longer just a victim, he was becoming an active participant in reclaiming his life. The weight of secrecy was lifting, replaced by a determination to expose the truth. However, as they delved deeper, Zach sensed the sheriff's watchful eyes. The constant paranoia hung in the air, a reminder that they were playing a dangerous game. It was only a matter of time before the confrontation would come to a head, and Zach was both terrified and ready to face whatever consequences lay ahead. In that moment of clarity, Zach realized that confronting the truth was not just about saving himself, it was about breaking the cycle of abuse that had ensnared him for too long. Little did he know that this journey would lead him to unexpected allies, revelations, and ultimately, a confrontation with the man he once admired. The path to freedom was fraught with danger, but Zach was ready to step into the light, no matter the cost. As the sun rose over the small town, it cast an eerie light on the events that had unfolded in the previous weeks. The air was thick with tension as whispers of Sheriff Samuel Lewis's alleged misconduct circulated among the townsfolk. Once revered as a pillar of the community, the sheriff was now under intense scrutiny, with many demanding justice for Zach and others who had suffered in silence. Zach had spent the last few days grappling with the weight of his decision to come forward. The once comforting presence of the sheriff now felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the truth that had emerged. He had confided in Detective Rachel Martinez, who had taken his allegations seriously. Together, they had gathered enough evidence to initiate an investigation that would change everything. The morning of the sheriff's scheduled arrest arrived, but the town remained blissfully unaware of the operation unfolding behind closed doors. Zach was at home, trying to process the emotional turmoil of the past weeks, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation about what was to come. Inside the sheriff's home, Samuel Lewis was busy packing away personal items, his demeanor a mix of arrogance and disbelief. He had received whispers of the investigation but had dismissed them as mere rumors. The sheriff had always believed himself untouchable, a king in his small domain. When the officers breached the door, chaos erupted. Officers surrounded the house, calling for Lewis to surrender. He resisted, reaching for his service weapon in a last-ditch effort to assert control over the situation. In the chaos that ensued, a single shot rang out, a gunshot that echoed through the halls of the sheriff's home. It was reported that Lewis had drawn his weapon and fired first. The officers had no choice but to respond. He fell to the ground, a look of disbelief frozen on his face as he took his last breath. The news of the sheriff's death soon spread through the community, creating an atmosphere of shock and confusion. The townspeople were torn between grief for a fallen leader and anger at the betrayal of trust. In the days that followed, Zach found himself at the center of this turmoil, his name now synonymous with the unraveling of the sheriff's once celebrated career. However, he found solace in the support of his family and close friends. They rallied around him, providing the love and encouragement he desperately needed. The weight of their collective pain brought them closer, and for the first time in a long while, Zach felt a glimmer of hope. As he sat with his loved ones, Zach prepared to share his story in a more personal setting. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges as he faced the memories of his past. Yet, he felt empowered, knowing that he was no longer alone in his struggle. The fall of Sheriff Lewis marked not just the end of a reign of terror, but also the beginning of a new chapter in Zach's life. A chapter defined by truth, resilience, and the unwavering support of those who believed in him. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would lead him to healing and self-discovery. In the wake of Sheriff Samuel Lewis's shocking demise, Zach and his family faced an uphill battle to rebuild the trust that had been shattered not only within their household but also with the community. The atmosphere in town was thick with a mixture of grief and anger, the townspeople grappling with the betrayal they felt from someone they had once held in high regard. Zach, now emerging as a symbol of courage, spent his days reflecting on the trauma he had endured and the path ahead. He understood that healing would not be an overnight process. As the days turned into weeks, his family engaged in open conversations about their feelings, fears, and hopes for the future. They attended therapy sessions together, learning how to navigate their emotions and the complex dynamics that had formed in the wake of the sheriff's actions. The community also began to change. Many residents had trusted the sheriff blindly, and the shocking revelations forced them to reconsider their definitions of authority and trust. They held town hall meetings, where citizens shared their experiences and listened to one another's stories. This newfound dialogue fostered a spirit of vigilance among the townsfolk. They learned the importance of questioning what was presented to them and not accepting authority without scrutiny. Meanwhile, Zach found solace in a local support group for survivors of trauma. It was here that he met others who had faced similar challenges, and he began to understand the profound impact of sharing one's story. The group's members offered one another a sense of community and solidarity, reminding Zach that he was not alone in his struggles. However, the journey toward healing was not without its challenges. Zach grappled with feelings of shame and guilt, often questioning if he could ever forgive himself for not speaking out sooner. His family reassured him that he was not to blame, but the internal conflict persisted. Zach learned that forgiveness, whether directed at himself or the sheriff, was a process that required patience and self-compassion. The weight of their collective trauma became evident during community events. Even as residents gathered to celebrate, an undercurrent of tension lingered. Many found it difficult to let go of their mistrust, fearing that the shadows of the past would resurface. Zach understood that this was a crucial time for his family and the town to heal, and he resolved to be a source of strength and hope. As the seasons changed, so did the town's outlook. Gradually, a sense of resilience emerged, and the residents began to embrace the lessons learned from their ordeal. They supported one another in ways they hadn't before, forming stronger bonds and fostering a community spirit that was grounded in understanding and empathy. Zach's family, united by their shared experiences, worked tirelessly to advocate for awareness around issues of abuse and authority. They partnered with local organizations to create educational programs that aimed to empower young people to speak out and trust their instincts. In reflecting on the heavy price of forgiveness, Zach realized that the journey ahead would be fraught with difficulties, but it would also be filled with opportunities for growth and connection. He understood that true forgiveness was not about absolution, but about finding peace within himself and helping to cultivate a community where trust could flourish once again. The story of the town served as a reminder that while the scars of the past might never fully heal, the strength found in vulnerability could lead to a brighter future. The residents learned to embrace their humanity, recognizing that everyone deserved a chance at redemption and healing, including themselves.